All right, so get this. Today we're going deep on the birth of Jesus. It's a story celebrated by millions, but also, let's be honest, has some pretty interesting mysteries surrounding it.
Oh, yeah, definitely. A pivotal event, for sure. And you all have sent in a ton of sources, everything from the historical context to biblical accounts and global traditions. It's a lot.
And that's what makes this deep dive so exciting, right? I mean, we're going way beyond the typical Christmas story to uncover stuff that most people probably don't know about. Like, for instance, did you know that we don't actually know the exact date of Jesus's birth?
That's right. It's a mystery. Most scholars think it was sometime between 6 BCE and 4 BCE during the reign of King Herod the Great.
Herod the Great. Okay, we are definitely going to circle back to him later because that's a whole other story. But first, if Jesus wasn't born on December 25th, why is that when we celebrate Christmas?
Good question. Well, one theory is that December 25th was chosen by the early church to kind of, coincide with, existing pagan festivals that were already going on around the winter solstice. Like, for example, the Roman celebration of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun.
That's pretty interesting. So early Christians maybe picked a date that people were already celebrating for other reasons. It makes you think about how much of how we understand Christmas today is tied to these really old traditions.
Totally. It's a super interesting example of how religious and cultural stuff can change and blend over time. But you know what else is interesting about the story?
Yeah, what's that?
The location. Like Bethlehem, it's not just a random town, is it?
I've never really thought much about that, but you're right. Bethlehem always seemed like a super important place. What makes it so special?
Well, it's close to Jerusalem geographically, which is important, but it also has a lot of symbolic meaning too. Like in Hebrew, Bethlehem means house of bread.
House of bread. Okay, now I get it. It connects to the whole idea of Jesus as the bread of life that you see in the gospel.
Exactly. And even before that, the name Bethlehem already had prophetic significance. Like if you go back to Micah 5.2 in the Old Testament, it says that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem.
Wow. So even before Jesus was born, the location was full of meaning. It's crazy how it all ties together. Okay, so we kind of have the when and the where figured out, at least broadly speaking. But what about the story itself? We have two main sources for the birth story. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke, right?
Right. And it's so cool how they both have their own way of telling this story,
Mm.
right? It adds all these layers that we might miss if we just focus on one.
All right, so let's start with Matthew. His account is like full drama. It starts with that intense dream that Joseph has.
Yeah, Joseph. He was engaged to Mary. Can you imagine what it was like to find out that she was pregnant? Back then, that would have been a huge scandal. So Joseph, he figures the best thing to do is to quietly divorce her to avoid, public shame.
Yeah, given how society worked back then, that makes sense. But then the whole story takes this crazy supernatural turn.
Totally. An angel appears to Joseph in a dream and basically explains the situation. He's like, look, this pregnancy is a miracle. It's a result of divine conception. The child will be the savior, the one to save his people from their sins, and tells him to name him Jesus.
Whoa. That must have been a wild experience for Joseph, to say the least. It makes you think about what he must have been going through.
Yeah, for sure. But then Matthew introduces the Magi, often called the wise men. They see this star and follow it to find the newborn king. And these guys, they journeyed from the east bearing gifts fit for royalty: gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
It's such a classic image. And I've always wondered what those gifts meant. They don't exactly scream baby shower presents.
Nope. Haha. Not exactly. But each one was really symbolic. Like gold, as the most valuable metal, represents Jesus' kingship. Then there's frankincense, this fragrant resin they used in religious ceremonies, and that points to his divinity. And then there's myrrh, an expensive oil used to anoint the dead. That one foreshadows his eventual sacrifice.
Wow, that is a lot to unpack. Those gifts, they weren't just random. They were carefully chosen to show deeper stuff about Jesus.
Exactly. It's like every detail in the story is there for a reason.
Okay, so before we go to Luke's gospel, we got to talk about King Herod, right? Things take a pretty dark turn there.
Yeah, King Herod, the ruler of Judea, he hears about this newborn king, a potential rival, and let's just say he wasn't thrilled. He was so threatened that he ordered all the baby boys under 2 years old in and around Bethlehem to be killed.
It's such a brutal act, all because of his paranoia and fear. Makes you think about the dangers Jesus faced even as a baby.
Definitely. Mary, Joseph, and Jesus had to escape to Egypt to avoid Herod's plan. They became refugees.
It was a perilous journey from the start. Okay, let's shift gears to Luke's gospel. What does he bring to the story?
Well, Luke focuses on a different side of the story, the more humble beginnings. He starts with a census ordered by Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor.
A census? That doesn't sound as exciting as angels and prophecies. What does that have to do with anything?
It was a big deal. Everyone had to go back to their hometowns to register. That's why Mary and Joseph, who lived in Nazareth, had to travel to Bethlehem, which was Joseph's ancestral home. That's why they were there for the birth.
Ah, so even Roman bureaucracy played a part. And of course, it's Luke who gives us the iconic image of Jesus being born in a stable.
Yes. There was no room at the inn, so they ended up in a stable, a place meant for animals. And Jesus was laid in a manger, an animal feeding trough.
Such a powerful image, the King of Kings, born in these super humble circumstances.
It really sets the tone for Luke's whole gospel. He also highlights the visit of the shepherds, these ordinary working class people. They're the first ones to hear about Jesus' birth.
I love that part. The shepherds, these humble, overlooked folks, are the first to get the message. It's such a contrast to King Herod and Caesar Augustus, these powerful guys.
Absolutely. Luke's all about showing that this good news, it's for everybody, no matter who they are or where they come from. So the shepherds, they go see the baby, and then they go out and tell everyone what they saw.
They're like the original evangelists, spreading the word. Their role might seem small, but it was huge.
Exactly. It shows how God can use anyone, even people who society might see as unimportant.
All right, so we've talked about the historical context and the different perspectives of Matthew and Luke. But here's where things get really interesting for me. What does it all mean? What's so special about Jesus' birth that it's celebrated by billions of people?
Now we're getting to the heart of it. For Christians, Jesus' birth isn't just a historical thing. It's seen as God stepping into human history. He's not just some great teacher or prophet. He's the Son of God, the Messiah, the one who came to save humanity.
Okay, I think I need a little help with that. What does it actually mean for Jesus to be the Son of God and the Messiah?
Well, in the Christian tradition, they see Jesus' birth as fulfilling all these prophecies from the Old Testament. For example, in Isaiah 7.14, it mentions a virgin birth and talks about Emmanuel, which means God with us. They understand that to be pointing to Jesus, God becoming human.
So his birth is more than just a single event. It's part of a bigger plan, a divine plan.
Right. And his birth is connected to the idea of salvation. The idea that through Jesus' life, his teachings, his death, and his resurrection, humanity can be reconciled with God. It's about finding redemption.
So for those who believe, the birth is just the beginning of this incredible journey that leads to forgiveness, change, and ultimately eternal life.
Exactly. And that message of hope and transformation, it still speaks to billions of people, even today.
It's pretty mind-blowing. Before we move on to the global impact of Jesus' birth, I want to focus on two figures who are often overlooked, Mary and Joseph.
You're so right. They're essential to the whole story.
Yeah, I mean, they often get overshadowed by the baby Jesus, but their roles are super important.
Totally agree. Mary, she was a young woman from Nazareth. Imagine being in her situation, unmarried, pregnant, facing judgment from everyone. Luke tells us that the angel Gabriel came to her and told her she would have a child by the Holy Spirit.
Whoa. I mean, that must have been absolutely overwhelming. How did she react to that?
Her response is a true testament to her faith. She was probably scared and confused, but she says, "I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled."
Wow. Talk about faith and obedience. It's no wonder she's so revered in Christianity. And that's why she's called the Mother of God, right?
Yeah. In Greek, it's Theotokos. That title acknowledges her role in giving birth to Jesus, who is seen as both fully God and fully human. Now let's talk about Joseph. He's often portrayed as a quiet, strong figure.
Yeah, he's definitely the strong, silent type. What makes him so important?
Well, he was under immense pressure. Think about it. He could have easily left Mary, but he chose to stay with her, to accept this child as his own. That took a ton of faith and bravery, especially back then.
You're right. Especially in a society where they would have been totally judged. His decision to protect and care for them says so much about who he was.
He became the earthly guardian of the Holy Family. He kept them safe.
It's really amazing how these two seemingly ordinary people were such a huge part of this event that changed history.
Yeah, their story reminds us that faith and courage can pop up in the most unexpected places, and that God can use anyone to do incredible things.
We've covered a lot here, the historical context, Matthew and Luke, the meaning of Jesus' birth, Mary and Joseph.
We've been busy, and this is just the beginning. The birth of Jesus has sparked all these traditions and celebrations around the world. It's mind-blowing.
You're right. From humble beginnings in a Bethlehem stable to, well, global traditions. That's impact. What are some of the most interesting Christmas customs you've come across?
So many. But one that really stands out is the nativity scene. It's such a visual way to tell the story. And it's something you see in homes and churches all over the world.
You know what I find fascinating about it? It's so simple. Mary, Joseph, baby Jesus, maybe some shepherds, and a few animals, but it evokes so much emotion.
It really does. It's a visual reminder of how humbly Jesus came into the world. And speaking of emotion, let's not forget about Christmas carols.
Who doesn't love belting out Silent Night during the holidays? What is it about Christmas carols that captures the spirit of Christmas so well?
Well, they're like musical time machines, you know? They take us back to the Christmas story and connect us to everyone who celebrated it before us.
It's amazing how music can do that. And then there's Midnight Mass. That's more than just your average church service, right?
Yeah, it's special. Held on Christmas Eve, Midnight Mass represents the culmination of Advent, which is a time of reflection and waiting for Christmas. It's solemn, but also joyful.
It's really amazing how this one event, Jesus' birth, has inspired so many different ways for people to express themselves, from art and music to special religious practices.
It shows just how much the Christmas story has influenced people over the centuries. But of course, we can't forget about the secular traditions, like gift-giving and Christmas trees.
You're right, they've become such a big part of Christmas. But they have interesting origins too, don't they?
Absolutely. Like with gift-giving, it goes back to the story of the Magi bringing gifts to the baby Jesus, remember? Gold for his kingship, frankincense for his divinity, and myrrh for his eventual sacrifice.
I remember, we talked about that earlier. It's amazing how something as simple as giving gifts can be connected to the Christmas story.
It goes to show how deeply rooted these stories are in our minds. And then there's the Christmas tree. It's not directly from the Bible, but you see them everywhere.
Yeah, it's so strange how decorating a tree with lights and ornaments became such a big part of Christmas. Any idea where that tradition came from?
The exact origin isn't clear, but it probably started with ancient winter solstice celebrations. Evergreen trees represented life and hope during the darkest part of the year. Then it evolved, and by the 16th century, decorated Christmas trees were all over Germany.
So, like we talked about before, this is another example of pagan and Christian traditions coming together.
Exactly. And even though the Christmas tree isn't mentioned in the Bible, it has parts that connect to the story. The star at the top represents the Star of Bethlehem, and the lights symbolize the light that Jesus brought into the world.
It's amazing how even in secular traditions, we find hints of the Christmas narrative. It just shows how deeply this event has shaped our culture and celebrations. But going deeper, what is it about the birth of Jesus that keeps speaking to people after all these centuries?
I think it boils down to a few basic things that everyone can relate to. First, hope. In the middle of darkness and uncertainty, Jesus' birth offers a sign of light, a promise of something new.
Yeah, that idea that hope can show up when you least expect it, that's super powerful, especially when things are tough.
Absolutely. And then, of course, there's love. The Christmas story, at its core, is a love story. It's about God's love for us, shown through the birth of his son.
Love, yeah, it's such a powerful theme. And that idea of selfless love, it's something that people all over the world connect with.
Exactly. And last but not least, there's redemption. The idea that broken things can be made whole. They see Jesus' birth as the start of a journey toward healing, both for individuals and for the whole world.
These themes, hope, love, redemption, they're universal and timeless. It makes sense why they continue to speak to people across cultures and across centuries. We've covered a lot of ground here: the historical context, Matthew and Luke, the meaning of Jesus' birth, and Mary and Joseph.
And we're just getting started.
You're right. What do you hope our listeners will take away from all of this?
Well, I think the most important thing is for them to remember that the story of Jesus' birth isn't just something to learn about or argue about. It's a story to connect with on a personal level.
You're right. It's about letting this story speak to us, challenge us, and maybe even change us.
Exactly. What speaks to you? How does it connect with what you've been through, your values, what you hope for, what you're afraid of?
Those are some big questions. But I think that's where the real power of this story is, in helping us think about those things, both on our own and with other people.
Absolutely. And remember, there's no one right answer. That's the cool thing about it. This story can speak to each of us in different ways.
It really is amazing how many different traditions and practices have come from just this one event. Earlier you mentioned nativity scenes. What other customs have popped up over the centuries because of the birth of Jesus?
Oh, tons.
Yeah.
We talked about nativity scenes, which are all about the visuals, but we can't forget the sounds of Christmas, right? I'm talking about Christmas carols.
Yes, Christmas carols. They're such a big part of Christmas. But what is it about them? What makes them so powerful? They're not just catchy songs, are they?
No, definitely not. They're more like, well, musical time capsules. They take us back to the Christmas story, connecting us to all the people who have celebrated before us. Like take Silent Night, for example. It's all about peace, quiet, and that incredible moment when Jesus was born. Or think about Oh Holy Night. That one's a powerful reminder that God literally came into the world as a human being.
It's interesting how different carols focus on different things. Some are all about joy and celebration, and others are more, I don't know, thoughtful and reflective.
Exactly. That's part of what makes them so cool. They show how the Christmas story has all these different sides to it.
We also can't forget about Midnight Mass. For a lot of Christians, it's a really important tradition, isn't it?
Totally. Midnight Mass, which happens on Christmas Eve, is more than just a regular service. It's like the big finale of Advent, which is that time of getting ready for Christmas. It's a time for quiet reflection, but also for celebrating Jesus' birth.
It's pretty amazing how this one event has inspired so many different ways for people to express their faith and their feelings, from art and music to these special religious practices.
Yeah, it shows how deeply this story has affected human culture. But of course, we can't forget about the secular traditions, like giving gifts and putting up Christmas trees.
You're right. Those are so connected to Christmas now, it's hard to imagine it without them. They have interesting backstories too, right?
Oh, for sure. Gift giving, for example, is connected to the story of the Magi bringing gifts to the baby Jesus. Remember gold for his kingship, frankincense for his divinity, and myrrh because it foreshadowed his sacrifice.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier. It's funny how even something as common as giving gifts can have a connection to the Christmas story.
It shows you how these stories have become part of who we are. And then there's the Christmas tree. You don't see it in the Bible, but they're everywhere during Christmas.
It's kind of strange how decorating an evergreen tree with lights and ornaments became such a big part of how we celebrate, right? Where did that even come from?
The exact origin is up for debate, but it probably goes back to celebrations people had for the winter solstice way before Christianity. They used evergreen trees to symbolize life and hope when it was the darkest part of the year. Over time, things changed, and by the 16th century, decorated Christmas trees were all over Germany.
So like we were saying before, this is another case of those pagan and Christian traditions mixing together.
Exactly. And even though the Christmas tree isn't in the Bible, there are definitely symbolic connections. The star on top, that often represents the Star of Bethlehem, and the lights, well, they can symbolize the light that Jesus is believed to have brought into the world.
It's pretty amazing how even traditions that seem totally unrelated to religion can have these little hints of the Christmas story hidden in them. It shows you how much this event has influenced our culture and how we celebrate. But going beyond all the traditions and the history, what is it about the birth of Jesus that still has meaning for people today?
I think it comes down to a few things that pretty much everyone can relate to, no matter who they are. The first is hope. When things are dark and uncertain, Jesus' birth gives us a little bit of light, a promise of something good and new.
Yeah, that idea that hope can appear out of nowhere, especially when things are tough. I mean, that's powerful stuff.
Totally. Then, of course, there's love. At its heart, the Christmas story is a love story. It's all about God's love for humanity and how that love showed up in the birth of his son.
Yeah, love. That's a big one. And selfless love. That's something that people all over the world can connect with.
You got it. And then there's redemption, the idea that broken things can be fixed. The birth of Jesus, for many, is seen as the first step on a journey toward healing, not just for individuals, but for the whole world.
These themes, hope, love, and redemption, they're so universal. It's no wonder they still resonate with people today. We've covered a lot in this deep dive: the historical context, Matthew and Luke, what Jesus' birth means, Mary and Joseph, different traditions. It's a lot.
And we're not done yet.
You're right. What's the one thing you hope our listener will take away from all of this?
That's a good question. I think the biggest thing is for them to remember that the story of Jesus' birth isn't just some historical event or religious idea. It's a story that's meant to connect with us on a personal level.
That's a great point. It's not just about learning facts. It's about letting the story make us think, challenge us, and maybe even change us.
Exactly. Think about what parts of the story really speak to you. How does it connect with your own life? what you believe in, what you hurt for, and what you're scared of.
Those are some deep questions, but I think that's what makes this story so powerful and makes us think about those things both on our own and with others.
Exactly. And don't forget, there's no single right answer. That's what's so cool about it. This story can connect with each of us in its own way.
You know, it's incredible to think about how just one event has sparked so much discussion and debate and artistic expression, you know? It's amazing. We've just scratched the surface in this deep dive. But I feel like I'm already seeing the birth of Jesus and its impact in a totally new light.
Yeah, it really shows how powerful this story is. I mean, it still resonates with people today, just like it did centuries ago, all over the world.
And for everyone listening, for those who've been with us on this journey, what's the most important thing you hope they'll remember about all of this?
That's a great question. I think the main takeaway is this. The story of Jesus' birth isn't just something to study or argue about. It's a story that's meant to touch us personally.
I love that. It's not just about filling our heads with facts. It's about letting the story get to our hearts, you know, to challenge us, inspire us, and maybe even change us.
Exactly. It's about asking ourselves, what parts of the story really speak to me? How does it connect to my own experiences and values, to my hopes and fears?
Those are some heavy questions, but I think that's where the true power of this story lies, in its ability to make us think about those big questions, both by ourselves and with others.
Totally agree. And remember, there's no one right answer to those questions. That's the beautiful thing about this story. It can speak to each of us in a totally unique and personal way.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the birth of Jesus, what's your final thought for our listeners? What do you want to leave them with?
Well, I want to encourage everyone listening to approach this story with an open mind and a sense of wonder. Let it spark your imagination, touch your heart. Let it be a source of inspiration and hope, and maybe even motivate you to make a positive difference in your own life and in the world.
That's beautifully said. And on that note, we'll bring this deep dive to a close. We hope this exploration has been enlightening and